At the most basic level, the Christian faith is about allegiance. Throughout Christian history, Christians have professed our allegiance to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit. God has and demands our ultimate allegiance. And that means, of course, that Christians must necessarily have a complicated relationship with the societies around them. Because after all, societies are headed by governments, and governments demand allegiance from people as well. And so Christians are faced with the situation, how do I square my unswerving allegiance to God with the allegiance that I also owe or ought to owe or may owe to the society and the government around me? Christianity has always had a complicated relationship with the societies around it. That relationship has changed dramatically at different points in Christian history. It's also been very different at the same time in history in different parts of the Christian world. And it's very different today in different parts of the Christian world. And so one of the things that Christians need to think about and consider and reflect upon and act upon is the question, how do I live out my ultimate allegiance to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit in the particular society in which I and in which we live at this time? Oftentimes, Christians turn to the early church, to the church of the first several centuries of Christian history, for some guidance about how to live out our faith in changing situations in various societies. But the problem is that many Christians today work with an understanding of the church's early relationship to the society around it, which is not wrong, certainly, but which is somehow less than fully comprehensive. I like to call that the Sunday school version of the story, because Sunday school is where many of us have gained our first impression of the way the church interacted with society in its first several centuries. Let me emphasize again, the Sunday school version of the story is not wrong, but it is oversimplified. It lacks some of the complexity, some of the nuance that we need in order to try to live faithfully in a very complicated societal situation today. So in this lecture, what I'd like to do is to call up the Sunday school version of the story, and then to try to expand our understanding of early Christianity beyond that Sunday school version of the story. So first of all, let's refresh our memory about the Sunday school version of the story. We learned in Sunday school and elsewhere that Christians were mercilessly persecuted by the Roman Empire, that they had to meet in secret in the catacombs underneath the city of Rome, that they were killed for sport by wild beasts and even by gladiators in the Colosseum for the entertainment of the pagan mob. We also have the idea that this persecution was widespread, was constant, and was intense for the first several centuries of Christian history, until the beginning of the 4th century, at which time the Roman Empire was dramatically converted to Christianity, and the persecution went from being extremely intense to being non-existent. Christians today look back at that Sunday school version of the story, and we have differing opinions about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. Some people say that when the church went from being a persecuted minority to being favored by the Roman Empire, it lost something fundamental about its identity, as if the conversion of the empire led to the sellout of the church to the pagan world. Other people look at the same event very differently, and they say that the conversion of the Roman Empire represented the triumph of Christianity, the triumph of the church over the pagan world. Once again, the Sunday school version of the story focuses on the Roman Empire, sees a period of intense and constant persecution, sees that as dramatically coming to an end in the early 4th century, and then interprets that change either as a triumph of the church or as a sellout of the church to paganism. That's what I call the Sunday school version of the story. Now, as I've said before, the Sunday school version of the story is not wrong. It is true that Christians were sometimes severely persecuted by the Romans. It is true that Christians were put to death in the Colosseum and elsewhere for the mere entertainment of a pagan mob. There were indeed Christians who suffered in gruesome ways under Roman rule. Some of the most famous of those Christians who suffered and died were in the early 2nd century Ignatius of Antioch, who was executed in Rome in the Colosseum around the year 110. Around the middle of the 2nd century, another person named Polycarp of Smyrna was very famously burned under Roman rule for his refusal to recant his Christian faith. And then perhaps the most dramatic and maybe one of the most famous examples of all came at the very beginning of the 3rd century when 2 women, Perpetua and Felicitas, were both imprisoned and were killed by wild beasts in the arena in Carthage in North Africa. So let me emphasize again, Christians who were caught in the wrong place at the wrong time suffered very gruesomely under the Romans. The persecution that we describe in the Sunday school version of the story is not wrong. But it is overstated. It is oversimplified. That version of the story lacks some of the comprehensiveness that we need in order to look back at this period and try to glean some lessons that can help us in our understanding of our Christian lives today. So what I would like to do in this lecture is to talk about some of the problems with the Sunday school version of this story, and then try to fill out that story as well as I can to give us some more nuance, some more comprehensiveness. A first major problem with the Sunday school version of the story is that it is based on only one region of the Christian church. It's based on the Roman Empire, which was all around the Mediterranean Sea. Many Christians today are unaware of the fact that the church existed far outside the Roman Empire, even in the 2nd and the 3rd centuries, at the very beginning of Christian history. Rome was not the only empire that had Christians in it. Most notably, the Persian Empire also had a significant number of Christians in it, and I'll come back and talk about Persia a little bit later in this lecture. Furthermore, Rome was not the only empire to become Christian in the 4th century. Actually, at the beginning of the 4th century, the first kingdom to become Christian was Armenia. The second was Georgia. The third was Aksum in what is today northern Ethiopia. And Rome was the 4th of the kingdoms to become Christian in the 4th century. In fact, it is possible that much earlier, in the late 2nd century, a small kingdom on the border between Rome and Persia by the name of Osroene had already become Christian. So you see that Rome is not the only place where there were Christians, and the Roman Empire was not the only empire to go from being pagan to being Christian. The situation was more varied, more complex than we typically think from the Sunday school version of the story. It's also important for us to recognize that even if we just look at the Roman Empire, the situation was much more uneven than the Sunday school version of the story would lead us to believe. Generally speaking, persecution was sporadic. It was local. Most of the time, there was no concerted effort by the Romans to wipe out the Christian church throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, there were really only 2 major times when local sporadic persecution rose to the level that you could call it empire-wide persecution. I'll talk about both of those persecutions in just a few minutes. It's also important for us to recognize that we need to make a distinction that we normally don't make. and that is the distinction between persecution and prosecution. According to Christians, from our point of view, whenever Christians are mistreated, we're likely to label that persecution. They are persecuting us because we are Christians, we might say. Now, that's not wrong, but that is certainly not the way the Romans normally understood it. In the mind of the Romans, they were not persecuting Christians for being Christians. They were not persecuting people of any religious faith for holding to that religion. What they were doing was prosecuting people for violating Roman law. In the mind of the Romans, you could have any religion you wanted as long as you were willing to give proper allegiance to the Roman Empire and to the pagan gods of Rome. If you were willing to do that, you could privately believe anything you wanted. You could privately do anything you wanted. The problem, of course, is that Christians had vowed a complete allegiance to the one true God. And so Christians were not generally willing to say, we'll offer some allegiance to the gods of Rome and to our own God on the side. Instead, they said, we will not worship the gods of Rome at all because our allegiance to our God, to the one true God, forbids us from doing so. And so Rome tended to single out Christians, and also Jews, by the way, for the same reason. But in the mind of the Romans, they were simply prosecuting people for breaking Roman laws. They were not persecuting people for being Christians per se. So again, the Sunday school version of the story could use some nuancing. It could use some filling out. It isn't wrong. There were people who were definitely killed in brutal ways under the Roman regime. But we need to fill out the picture that we get from the Sunday school version of the story in order to try to have a better factual basis and historical basis from which to try to make decisions about how we should live today as Christians in various different societies. So what I'd like to do first is to fill out the picture of Christians in Roman society. And then after that, I want to talk about something which is likely not very well known to us, that is Christians in early Persian society. And then I want to look very briefly about the possibility that there were Christians in Indian society as well in these first few centuries, and what their situation might have been like. As we'll see, at different times the situations were very different. And in different places, Roman Empire, Persian Empire, and India, the situation was very different for Christians. So first let's fill out the picture of Christianity and Roman society. Up to the year 249 AD, persecution was local, it was sporadic, and it should perhaps not even be called persecution. It may be better to call it simply prosecution. Things significantly changed in the year 249, and I'll come back to that year in just a minute. But from the birth of the church around 30 AD up until 249, let's talk about that situation now. Originally in the Roman Empire, Christians were regarded as a sect of Judaism, and Judaism was a legal religion in the Roman Empire. So Christians actually had a little bit of protection under Roman law by virtue of the fact that the Romans couldn't tell them apart from the Jews. That began to change, though, in the decade of the 60s, shortly after the middle of the 1st century AD. Two major events in that decade were the Great Fire in Rome in July of the year 64 and the Jewish-Roman War from 66 to 70 AD. The fire that began in Rome in July of 64 burned a great deal of the city of Rome. There was massive destruction, and an enormous part of the city had to be rebuilt. The Roman emperor, Nero, was actually accused of having set the fire himself, because it was believed, rightly or wrongly, that he wanted to raise the city to the ground in order to build a more magnificent palace for himself. Nero was in a little bit of a bind because of these accusations, and his response was to say, "It was the Christians, not me." He started the fire. And in order to distract attention from himself, Nero began an action against Christians in and around the city of Rome in the year 64. And this action against Christians lasted from 64 until Nero's suicide in the year 68. It was not empire-wide. It was not directed at Christians simply for being Christians. It was confined to the city of Rome, and it was mainly a matter of trying to distract attention from Nero over the fire in Rome. A second major event of the 60s was that in the year 66, the Jews in Israel rebelled against the Romans. And there was a massive uprising that we call the Jewish-Roman War. And the Romans mercilessly put down the Jewish uprising and actually destroyed the Jewish temple in the year 70 AD. What was striking about the Jewish-Roman War, though, was that almost no Christians took part in that. The Christians were beginning to recognize by this point, we are separate from the Jews. And the Romans were beginning to recognize the Jews and the Christians are something separate. So Christianity from this point began to be more and more distinct from Judaism. And as a result, the Romans began paying attention to the Christians, and occasionally there were Roman actions against the Christians. Up until the year 249, there were sporadic Roman actions, you could call them persecutions if you wanted to, against Christians. The first of those I've already mentioned, which was in the area around Rome itself from 64 to 68, the action against Christians under Nero. The second major one occurred in what is today Western Turkey, what was then called Anatolia or Asia Minor. And this was instituted by the Roman Emperor Domitian. It was confined to Anatolia, to Western Anatolia. It was not widespread, but it was quite severe in the middle of the 90s. This may be the action which forms the background to the book of Revelation. Scholars are undecided about whether John wrote Revelation during the Domitian persecution in the 90s or earlier during the Neronian persecution in the 60s. But again, neither one of these was empire-wide. Neither one of these was an attempt to wipe out Christianity altogether. There was also another local action in Gaul in what is today southern France in 177 and 178 under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. This action was also narrowly confined, and this one was rather short-lived as well. And then in the year 202 and 203, there were actions against Christians in various different places in the Roman Empire, all at about the same time. Scholars disagree on whether these should be called a coordinated persecution of Christians by the emperor, whose name was Septimius Severus, or whether it just happened that there were outbreaks of local persecution at the same time. But the main point that I want to make here is that most of the time, Christians were not unduly harassed by the government. And in most places, Christians were not unduly bothered by the government. A given governor, a given official at a given time in a given place could be very severe in his actions against Christians. And for Christians who were caught in that time and that place, life could be very grim indeed. But this was not the norm. The norm was for Rome to distrust Christians, but not to pay a particularly great amount of attention to them. It was not constant persecution. It was not empire-wide. And it's arguable whether it should even be called persecution. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that there were two major exceptions to that general trend, though. there were two actions against Christians, one in the middle of the 3rd century and the other at the beginning of the 4th century, that should probably be called persecutions by any measure. The first began in the year 249 as a new emperor came to the throne, whose name was Decius. And Decius was convinced that the greatness of Rome lay in its worship of the old Roman gods. And so in the beginning of the year 250, in January of 250, Decius issued a decree that throughout the empire, everybody, all heads of household, were to offer sacrifices to the Roman gods. And they were required to get a certificate saying that they had offered the prescribed sacrifices. Now, in the mind of Decius, he didn't care what other gods you wanted to worship on your own. So if Christians were willing to offer these sacrifices and then turn around and offer the Lord sacrifice or worship the Lord, that was none of his business. But what Decius didn't understand, of course, is that unlike pagan Romans, Christians had a unique and unequivocal and complete allegiance to the Lord, which prohibited them from also worshiping other gods. Pagan Romans were not like that. They could easily make room in their allegiance for another god here, another god there. So beginning in the year 250, there was for the first time a fairly systematic empire-wide action against Christians. Decius went after the bishops, thinking that if he got rid of the leaders of the church, the rest of the Christians would come into line and be willing to offer sacrifice to the pagan gods. The persecution was intense for about a year and a half until Decius died in June of the year 251. Then there was a period when there was no persecution under his successor. And then under another Roman Empire by the name of Valerian, the persecution was very intense from 257 to 258 and 259. Valerian redoubled the efforts to find the bishops of the church and to exile them. In 258, he upped the penalty from exile to execution. And so this persecution was very intense in the latter part of the 250s. But then the persecution basically ended altogether with Valerian's death in 260. So this Decian-Valerian persecution in the 250s is the first major example of an empire-wide action against Christians in the Roman Empire. This was not the biggest one. The biggest empire-wide action against Christians came at the beginning of the 4th century under the Emperor Diocletian. Diocletian was not initially opposed to Christianity, and he even had Christians on his staff and Christians in his family. But one of his aides by the name of Galerius very dramatically talked Diocletian into recognizing that the Christians were dangerous, or believing that the Christians were dangerous. And at the very beginning of the 4th century, Diocletius came to agree with Galerius that something needed to be done about the Christians. In the year 303, in February of 303, Diocletian issued edicts saying that throughout the empire, the scriptures should be burned, the church buildings should be torn down, and Christians who refused to comply should be put to death. So this was a very severe persecution. But even here, let me emphasize that it varied greatly from place to place. In Anatolia, in Egypt, the persecution was very severe for almost 20 years. In Latin North Africa, what is today Algeria and Tunisia, it was very severe for a couple of years and then dramatically ceased. Up in the northwestern part of the empire, in Britain, there was hardly any persecution at all. So even in what we call the Great Roman Persecution under Diocletian, the persecution was very uneven, very severe for some people, very severe in some places, but not very severe in other places. So what I hope we can see here is that the actions against Christians could be quite intense in the Roman Empire, but in most times and most places, there was relatively little that could be called persecution. Of course, all of that dramatically changed with the conversion of the person who would go on to become the new Roman emperor, whose name was Constantine. In the year 305, Diocletian took the almost unprecedented step of abdicating as Roman emperor, and he moved to what is today Croatia, to a magnificent retirement village on the seacoast, and he spent the rest of his life there. That left a power vacuum for control of the Roman Empire. And one of the people who stepped into that vacuum was a young man who was a military commander way up in Britain by the name of Constantine. Constantine's army declared him to be the new Roman emperor. And he took that to heart and went on a campaign to capture control, military control, of the Roman Empire. Very quickly, he gained control of what is today France, what is today Spain, what is today Britain. And then he moved over the Alps into Italy, seeking to gain control of Rome itself. In October of the year 312, Constantine was set to fight against Maxentius, who controlled the central part of the Roman Empire. This is the famous Battle of Milvian Bridge, one of the most important military battles in world history. On the day before the battle, according to the story, Constantine was trying to decide what gods to rely on in order to try to defeat Maxentius in battle. And he had some sort of a vision which he believed came from the Christian God. And he received some kind of sign. He saw some kind of sign in the sky with the message, "Conquer by this." Constantine believed then that this was a sign that he should follow the Christian God, and if he did so, he would gain control over the entire Roman Empire. So he swore allegiance to the Christian God. He had the sign drawn on the shields of his warriors. And the next day, on October 28th of 312, they unexpectedly were able to rout the forces of Maxentius and to gain control of Rome. Over the next 12 years, Constantine was also able to gain control of the rest of the Roman Empire. And in the course of gaining control, Constantine increasingly began to favor Christianity. So Christianity went from being severely persecuted in some parts of the empire to being favored, if not actually the official religion of the empire yet. It was a dramatic turnaround, and it had a significant influence on the church in the Roman Empire. Many people, as I said, regard this as the triumph of Christianity. As a whole society, a great empire began to embrace the Christian faith. Other people see it as a sellout, because all of those people who supposedly became Christians, many people think, well, actually they just retained their pagan beliefs and they changed their name to Christians. So they see this as being either a triumph or a sellout of the church, depending on their perspective. Now, what I want to emphasize as we think about this is that the change was dramatic, but the relation between the church and Roman society had always been complicated. And even after this, it would always be complicated. We've seen that persecution was not widespread all the time. It was not present everywhere at all times. The situation varied dramatically within the Roman Empire in different times and different places. In the second lecture, we're going to look at the way Christians responded to the varying situations that they had in the Roman Empire to try to see what we can learn from them. But in the meantime, though, we need to recognize that Christianity was not merely present in the Roman Empire. It was also present in the Persian Empire and may have been present in India as well. So now I'd like to turn our attention to Persia to talk about the situation of the church in the Persian Empire. To some of us, it may come as a surprise that I speak of the church in Persian society, because we may not think of Persia, what is today Iran and part of Iraq, as being a Christian country at any point in its history. We may not realize that there have ever been very many Christians in Persia. But in fact, Christianity came to the edges of the Persian Empire on the border between Rome and Persia in what is today eastern Turkey, came to that region almost as early as it came to other parts of the Roman Empire. At the same time that Paul was moving into Europe with the gospel, other apostles were taking the gospel to other areas as well. And it's quite possible that in the first century, Christianity entered the Persian Empire. Even if it didn't happen in the first century, it's virtually definite that Christianity was proliferating within the Persian Empire in the second century. So what we have is a very different empire with a very different societal situation, and Christians present in the Persian Empire just as they were present in the Roman Empire. So let me talk for a little bit about the situation of Christians in the Persian Empire. There were two great dynasties that ruled the Persian Empire in the early centuries of Christianity. The first was the Parthians, and the second was the Sassanids. The Parthians took over control of Persia in 247 BC, and they ruled until AD 224. So at the beginning of the church in the Persian Empire, it was Parthian Persia, the Parthian dynasty, was controlling that empire. The Parthians were very benign rulers. They ruled by means of an extremely decentralized system that gave a lot of control to local governors. And so the decentralization meant that there was not likely to be any concerted action against Christianity or any other religion for that matter. Furthermore, one of the striking things about Persian imperial policy is that they hated the Romans. And so whatever the Romans did, the Persians were going to do the opposite in reaction. The Parthian Persians, knew that the Romans didn't like the Christians. And so that fact in and of itself meant that Christians were going to be tolerated in the Persian Empire. We will not do what Rome does. If the Romans don't like the Christians must not be so bad. And so under the Parthian regime, Christians were able to live as a small, somewhat scattered minority in a great deal of peace. Another reason for this peace that the Christians enjoyed in the Persian Empire is that the major religion of the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism. And Zoroastrianism was a dualistic religion, that is to say, it held to equal principles, one good, the other evil. Instead of one high God and then other beings below him, Zoroastrianism held to the beneficent spirit, the good God, and the angry spirit, the evil God, and they were equal. Now that is fundamentally different from Christianity, because Christianity affirms that even the devil is not equal to God. All created beings are below God. But even though it's fundamentally different from Christianity, it didn't look as different from Christianity as paganism did. Christians in Zoroastrian Persia did not stand out as much as Christians did in pagan Roman Empire. And so this is another reason why the Christians were more or less left alone and enjoyed a fair degree of peace in the Persian Empire in the first couple of centuries. Let me stop there and call your attention to how different this is than what we think. If we think about this part of the world, Iran and Iraq today, it's hard for us to imagine that this could be the place where Christians dwelt peacefully. We need to remember the world has not always been the way it is today. The world has not always been as we envision it. What is now one of the places where Christians are most mistreated in the world, was at that time one of the places where Christians had a relatively favorable situation with respect to their society. That began to change in the year 224, when the Parthian dynasty was defeated and a new dynasty, the Sassanids, took over control of Persia. The Sassanids were much more zealous in their Zoroastrianism than the Parthians had been. And they took steps to turn Zoroastrianism into the state religion of Sassanid Persia. And as a result, there began to be a lot more religious unrest and a lot more suspicion of religious minorities than there had been. And there was a little bit of persecution of Christians toward the end of the 3rd century. But still, by and large, the situation was quite favorable to Christians. That all changed, though, in the 4th century. And it changed precisely because of the changes in the Roman Empire. Remember that the Persians hated the Romans. So when the Romans didn't like Christians, the Persians tolerated them. But when the Romans began to embrace Christianity, the Persians began to be suspicious of it. In the year 309, a boy was born by the name of Shapur, who was to rule as the Shah of Persia for his entire life, from 309 until 379. In the year 315, when Shapur was only 6 years old, the newly converted Constantine wrote him a letter urging him to treat Christians well and urging him to become a Christian himself. This alerted Shapur's advisors to the fact that Rome had changed its policy towards Christians, and so the Persians began to be suspicious of Christians. Then in the 330s, Constantine prepared for an attack on Persia. Throughout Roman history, the Romans had sought to conquer Persia. They never succeeded, but they never stopped trying. And in the 330s, Constantine was preparing to attack Persia again. He died in the year 337, but then shortly after he died, Shapur was able to counterattack and to retake the Persian territory that had been held by the Romans. As a result of that, Shapur blamed the earlier defeat on Christians within Persia. The rumor began to circulate that the Christians were providing military intel to the Romans to help the Romans defeat the Persians. And so Shapur unleashed a merciless persecution of Christians. He doubled taxes on Christians. He ordered the churches destroyed. He ordered the execution of any bishops who did not take part in the public Zoroastrian worship. He forced the main bishop of Persia, his name was Simon, to watch 100 other people be executed right in front of him, 100 other Christian bishops, before Simon himself was executed. Christian leaders were killed. Converts to Christianity from Zoroastrianism were targeted, and occasionally Christians were simply indiscriminately martyred. The persecution was intense throughout the Persian Empire. It was far worse than even the worst of the Roman persecutions of Christians. Sometimes we call the Roman persecution of Diocletian the Great Persecution. We should call that one the Great Roman Persecution. Now we're learning of the Great Persian Persecution, and the Great Persian Persecution was considerably more devastating than the Roman persecution ever was. As time went on and as the Roman threat to Persia receded, the persecution gradually ended around the year 400 or so. But even so, Christians in Persia had to live with a very uneasy relationship with Persian society for the rest of their history. So what we see is that Rome went from various periods of persecution to state support of the church. Persia went from state tolerance of the church to brutally severe persecution at the same time and as a direct result of the conversion of the Roman Empire. Let's talk just a few minutes now about the possible situation in India. There are traditions suggesting that Thomas took the gospel to India in the 1st century, and those may very well be true, or it may be true that Christianity came to India in the 2nd century. It's hard to tell for sure. All we know for sure is that there was already Christianity present in India by the year 345. But it is certainly possible that there was Christianity in Indian society in the 3rd, the 2nd, maybe even in the 1st century. Indian society was highly stratified. There were the high classes and the low classes. The higher classes were called the Sanskriti because of the language that they spoke. The lower classes were called the Dravidians, the native Indian population. The Christians who were in India whenever they got there seem to have gravitated toward the Sanskriti and to have worked among the Sanskriti, not among the Dravidians. So the Christian church in the early centuries in India had very little impact on the society as a whole, but it also had a very privileged position because it was a part of the higher classes in India. There are some traditions of a little bit of persecution in India in the late 3rd century. We don't know whether they are reliable or not. But for the most part, Christians in Indian society had a privileged position, but one that was more or less on the margins of society, rather than being a part of the broader Indian society. So if we widen our field of view and look not just at Rome, but also at Persia and perhaps even at India, and as we pay attention to what's happening at different time periods in the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th centuries, we recognize that the Christian church in different places and at different times had to face very, very dramatically different situations. From one place to another, it was very different. From one time to another in the same place, it was very different. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the different ways that Christians responded to those wildly divergent situations. For now, I want to leave us with the recognition that we should not take too narrow a view of historical events. The question of whether the conversion of the Roman Empire was a sellout or the triumph of the church is complicated enormously when we recognize that the situation of Christians varied tremendously in different areas, that Christianity was not merely present within the Roman Empire. We should not take too narrow a view or too parochial a view when we look at different events in ancient Christian history. Of course, that's true of current events today as well. We should not take too narrow a view or look only at our situation when we think about the situation of the church in the world today as well.